which was a wonderful memory in writing this book.
You've talked of stealth theology. You just used some stealth linguistics in that answer. You talked about digitalia. Glossolalia is the Greek word for, in essence, speaking in tongues, because glossa means
tongue,
and the lalia is the speaking. So when you said that you had the
non-biblical spiritual gift of digitalia,
would you explain?
That means I feel like God is writing through my fingers on the computer because I'm not aware of what I'm saying in advance, and it doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does, and it did with this book.
That you just you were speaking in fingers,
right? But I will say that God drew from 50 or 60 years of previous study and all of that, and gifts that He had given all together.
Yeah, and in fairness to the process, were you getting some new revelation and insight that you weren't aware of, or was it a pooling of how God had already used the roots that you have that had grown deep in your faith?
It was definitely bringing to mind what I had known already.
Okay. How do you decide what to put in and what not to put in?
I don't know.
Well, that clarifies it.
That's a hard question to answer. Some things seem obvious to put in. Some things are obvious not to put in. A whole lot of it is in between. And so, for example, David and Goliath would have been a great story to include. And if I were writing again, maybe I would. But for some reason, David and Goliath didn't make the cut this time.
So you left out the uncircumcised Philistines throughout?
Nobody's mentioned as to their status regarding that particular rite.
Okay. Edward, I want to read, I asked Edward to pull out a section or two that we might read and then have him comment on. So if you want to read along with me, that's great. If not, I think it's wonderful to be listening sometimes, especially to stories as this. Edward suggested that I read on page 71 the first 3 paragraphs under the dreadful mountain. So I'm going to read this to you, and before I do it, Edward, some people will be watching this on the internet, and they will not have been here today to get a copy of your book. How could they get a copy of this?
They and anyone else can get this, and also anything else I've produced, and a whole ton of free materials by going to my website, which is edwardfudge.com. And everything that I know and do is on there. Right. So please check it out. There's also a Grace Mail publication that goes out 3 times a week. If you don't get that, check it out on edwardfudge.com. Sign up for it. It's free. You can quit any time and you get double your money back.
Can we get this book off places like Amazon.com?
It's on all those kind of places. It will be hopefully after June in Lifeway stores, and later I understand it should be in Costco stores.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well then I will start reading from page 71. This is a chapter called Making Covenant, and this is under a bold print that says the dreadful mountain. 3 months out of Egypt, the Israelites come to Mount Sinai, the place where the Creator had appeared to Moses in the burning bush. This time the Creator tells Moses to prepare the people. They're about to encounter Yahweh, the God who rescued them from Egypt, then brought them through the Red Sea. For 2 days, the people wait in anxious anticipation for their invisible Creator. On the 3rd day, the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. The rugged mountain already struck awe into the people's hearts, accustomed as they were to the flatlands of Egypt. But now this awesome scene turns foreboding. The mountain belches smoke like a furnace. Tremors rumble through its cliffs, and its peaks begin to quake. A heavy cloud shrouds the sky until day seems as night. Peals of thunder blast like a trumpet over the mountain, echoing into the wilderness beyond. Flashes of lightning pierce the pitch-black sky. The Creator, who rescues is no domesticated deity. He is master of the primal elements. He is God of heaven and earth. Wow.
That was probably the focal point of the Jews' experience with God. It was combined with their deliverance from Egypt, their gospel, you might say. And I wanted very much to try to paint a word picture here that would give us some of the sense of awe and sense of fear and trembling that they must have experienced on that occasion.
Now, you've got a limit to the pages that you can write.
Basically.
You're having to cut stories to make sure that you make this readable and digestible.
Right.
I assume, knowing you as I do, you were fairly selective with your words. Did you purposefully point out that on the third day the Lord came down from Mount Sinai, came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain? Or did that just sort of stumble in there on the third day? God has a habit of doing things on third days.
Well, it does say that. They waited 2 days, and the next day after that, God comes down.
Okay. Just found it interesting.
I thought maybe I missed something.
No. I think you're right.
If he was right, he gets 5 points.
Edward, what's your favorite story in the Bible?
Oh, boy.
Let me break it down. What's your favorite story to preach on in the Bible?
Favorite story in the Bible or to preach on or to write about is somehow the story of Jesus as he fulfills everything that went before and as he unfolds everything that's coming after.
And why is it that you enjoy that the most?
Because that's the focal point of the Bible. It's the focal point of our salvation. It's the focal point of human history as it interacts with God.
In that regard, one of the other sections that you've asked me to consider reading is on page 141. It's chapter 37, entitled, "It is Finished." Might John himself have heard it, the final word of Jesus, when he bowed his head and died? We cannot say for sure, although John does report it in the gospel that bears his name. When we consider what Jesus has endured, the scourging and pummeling, the crucifixion itself, the cramping and hunger and thirst, the utter fatigue of body and mind, we might marvel that he utters any words at all. But despite it all, he does. He opens his mouth and says it. A single word in Greek, though in English 3. He says it, and someone hears it, whether John or not. And John, sensing that it was important, writes it in his gospel. Tetelestai, says Jesus, it is finished. Had his language offered the tools, John surely would have marked this as an exclamation. It is finished, exclamation mark. But punctuation marks aside, we still can understand. This is a cry of victory and not defeat. With this word projected by his final breath, Jesus crosses the finish line. Though weak in volume, he claims a mighty triumph. With 4 syllables, Jesus signals the successful conclusion of a life devoted wholly to the Creator. Faithful in life, he is now faithful in death. Through this faithful life and death, the divine rescue is a reality. It's beautifully written.
Thank you. The next chapter is called "It Is Enough," which is about the resurrection and Jesus' ascension to heaven. Because when Jesus dies on the cross, he pays the price of sin, as we sometimes put it. When God raises him from the dead, he gives him his receipt. Isaiah had said, "He shall see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify the many." So Jesus completes his work of saving. God endorses it and stamps it and approves it and gives him a place of honor at his right hand in heaven.
Now, Edward, you were working through this book, and we're fairly through with it when you and Sarah Faye graciously had Becky and I over for supper a number of months ago. And I remember you being tickled pink over the work you were doing titling each chapter. You worked really hard on the titles alone. Talk to us a little bit about how you went about doing that.
Well, the first thing I wanted to do was divide the book into kind of major sections, and you may notice some sort of pattern to that. That we talk about the reality first, which begins with the mess the world is in and why we need a rescuer. Then the repetition, how the world starts but falls into sin immediately, and God destroys the old world and starts over with a new one. Then readiness, in which he gets his people ready for the rescue through the rest of the Old Testament. Revelation, in which throughout that period he gives them hints and clues and prophecies of what he's going to do when the Messiah comes.